They said family was supposed to be my safe place, but mine became the cage I could never escape. Every smile I forced was a mask hiding the bruises no one wanted to see. My childhood wasn't lived, it was survived. And I still remember the night I finally realized no one was coming to save me. The night I finally ran felt like the world itself was collapsing behind me. The floorboards of that old wooden house heavy, creaked beneath my chest feet, burned, and every sound echoing like a scream. But I didn't stop. I couldn't, because behind me, his voice was still there, calm, cold, promising the same punishment he had whispered all my life. No one will ever believe you. I was 16 years old, barefoot, bleeding, running through the dirt road that led away from the only place I had ever known. The rain that night was heavy, had stolen slicing through my skin I was, like shards of glass. But it also felt like baptism, like something in me was finally being washed clean of years of secrets, manipulation, and fear. My childhood ended before it ever began. I remember being 7 when he first told me I was special, that I was different from the others. I didn't understand what he meant. I only knew my mother never saw on my shoulder, or maybe wrong, she chose not that to. His smile didn't reach his eyes. He just wants the best for you, sweetie. But his version of the best was silence, obedience, and a life that wasn't mine to live. He controlled everything. The clothes I wore, the friends I wasn't allowed to have, the words I could say. If I dared to question him, punishment came quietly. A locked room, no to the food, neighbors, hours he was a respected man, the kind who my fixed fences trembled and gave people advice at church. But behind closed doors, he built a cage out of fear and called it love. I learned early that truth was dangerous. Every time I tried to tell my mother, she'd panic, trembling, whispering, "Don't say that. You'll ruin everything." She was his prisoner too, just in a different way. He had broken her long to smile at the dinner table. So, I learned that the monster sitting across from me wasn't real, pretending that I was safe. The years passed slowly, like waiting for dawn in a world without sun. At 12, I began to believe his words, that I was the problem, that without him I'd be nothing. He made sure of that. He'd burn my drawings if they didn't please him, tear my notebooks apart. Every time a single he destroyed something that sounded ungrateful, a part of me disappeared with it. I started keeping my secrets in places he wouldn't look, behind the wallpaper, inside broken toys, in the soil beneath the apple tree. I buried pieces of myself like treasure, hoping that one day someone would find them and remember who I was supposed to be. But no one came. No one ever came. Until the day the smell of burnt coffee, or rather the sound of what was left of me, ticking that day started like any other. The weight of his eyes on me as I passed by. But something inside me had changed. Maybe it was the way the light entered through the cracked window, touching the bruises that hadn't yet healed. Maybe it was because I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I was disgusted. That disgust became fire. I remember the exact moment I looked at him and saw not a father, not a protector, but a weak man hiding behind control. He noticed the change in me, too. He saw that I no longer trembled when he raised his voice. That's when everything began to fall apart. He tried to remind me who I was, his words, his rules, his power. But I didn't listen. For the first time, I didn't care what would happen next. As he slept, I packed a small bag, one change of clothes, a few dollars I'd hidden for you, and a photograph of my mother before she lost her smile. I didn't even look back when I stepped outside. The sky was dark, but for the first time, darkness didn't scare me. It felt like freedom. I didn't know where I was going, only that every step away from that house was a step closer to myself. The cold air bit into my skin, my bare feet ached, and my heart raced. But inside that pain, there was something new. Hope. A small, trembling hope that maybe, somewhere out there, I could start again. That maybe I could learn to exist without fear. I didn't know yet that the hardest part wasn't running away. It was facing the world with nothing but a broken heart and a story I remember waking up on that first morning of freedom, lying beneath a broken roof in an abandoned shed at the edge of town. The smell of damp wood and rust filled the air, and my body ached from the cold night. My clothes were soaked, my feet raw, but for the first time in my life, no one was watching me. No one was telling me what to do. The silence felt strange, too big, too loud, but inside that am I silence, now? For something small began to grow. I had been nothing more than a reflection of someone else's will. Now, there was only emptiness, but it was mine. I spent the next few days wandering through the streets of a nearby town called Lanton, just 30 kilometers away from the house I'd escaped. It was a quiet place, with narrow roads and people who never looked long enough to ask questions. I slept that. Behind it old gave me space to disappear. Bus stations, and sometimes under the bridge that crossed the frozen river. Every night, the memories came back, his voice, the locked doors, the smell of fear that used to cling to me. But every morning, I woke up still free, and that was enough to keep going. It didn't take long for hunger to teach me how survival really works. I found a small diner on the corner of Main Street, where the owner, a woman named Claire, would leave leftover bread by the back door. She knew I was taking it. She never said a word. One evening, she stepped outside, handed me a cup of coffee, and simply said, "You can work for it if you want." I nodded. That was the first time in my life someone had offered me something without expecting fear in return. She paid me a few dollars a day, dishes, not much, cleaning tables, but enough to eat, doing and buy a cheap coat from the thrift store across the street. She never asked where I came from. I think she saw it in my eyes, the kind of pain you don't need to explain. For a while, that diner became my safe place. The hum of conversation, the smell of fried eggs, the clinking of cups, all of it was life. Ordinary and fragile. Months passed, but real. And I learned how to smile again, like a secret. Not the fake smile I wore at home, but something small, uncertain, and mine. Yet, Even as I began to build a new version of myself, the ghosts of my past never stopped following me. Sometimes I'd hear his voice in my head, whispering, "You'll come back. You always come back." And for a terrifying moment, I believed him. That fear drove me to hide myself Eli, never using my real name, safe, never telling anyone. But you can't erase blood, no matter how far you run. One day, a man came into the diner asking questions. He wore a suit, carried a photograph, and said he was looking for a missing girl. My heart stopped. The picture was me, thinner, younger, but unmistakably me. Claire looked at me, then at him, after he left, and said, she turned to me and said softly, "Whoever you're running from, make sure you keep running." That night, I packed again. I left Lanton without saying goodbye. The bus ticket I bought took me to the city, noisy, crowded, and merciless. There, no one cared who I was, and for a while, that anonymity was a blessing. I found work cleaning hotel rooms, learned to sleep but city silence, life taught me another kind of loneliness. The kind that comes when you realize freedom doesn't erase what happened to you. It just gives it new shadows. I'd see families walking together, laughing, and something inside me would twist. I envied them, but I also feared them. Trust felt like a language I had forgotten. The only thing I truly trusted was distance. Still, something inside me was slowly changing. I began to understand that survival wasn't just about escaping someone. It was about learning how to exist without the chains they left behind. Years went by. I turned 18, then 19. My scars faded, but the memories didn't. Sometimes I'd write them down in a notebook I kept hidden beneath my mattress. Every word a piece of the story I had never told anyone. Writing was like bleeding one night, dying while walking home, but it kept me alive. A church. A sign on the door read, "Free counseling for survivors." I stood there for a long time, reading the words over and over. Survivor. I had never used that word before. It felt too heavy, too brave for someone like me, but something in me knew I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to face what had been done to me, not just survive it. The church was quiet. The next morning, I went inside. The kind of quiet that decision that would change everything. And heavy. Like every sound carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. The air smelled of candles and dust, and when the door closed behind me, it was as if the world itself exhaled. I stood there, frozen, not sure if I belonged in a place like this. I hadn't prayed in years. Maybe I never truly had. I used to whisper to God as a child, begging him to make it stop. But after so many nights of silence, I stopped believing he listened. Yet something about that morning felt different, like maybe, just maybe, this was where my story had to begin again. A woman approached me, gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her voice soft enough to make me drop my guard for a second. "You're safe here," she said. She handed me a small card. My throat felt like it was closing. Therapist, doctor, Alana Pierce. I stared at it for a long moment before nodding. That was the beginning of the hardest journey of my life, the journey back into my own past. The first session was unbearable. Doctor Pierce's office was small, filled with books, the smell of coffee, and a kind of silence that made it impossible to hide. Questions that dragged me back to the house. Want to answer. The whispers, the fear. I remember her saying, "You don't have to tell me everything at once. Just start where it hurts the least." But there was no such place. Every memory was sharp, every word tasted of blood. For weeks, I barely spoke. I'd just sit there, staring at the wall behind her, where a single photograph hung, a woman standing in front of the ocean. It reminded me of my mother, turned toward the horizon, of how she used to stand by the window at dusk, lost in thoughts she never shared. One day, I asked Dr. Pierce why people stay silent. She said, "Because silence is the only thing they're allowed to keep." That sentence stayed with me for days. Maybe that was why my mother had never defended me. Maybe her silence wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was survival. But Pierce still asked if I wanted to see my mother not again. Yet. The question one hit me like a blow. I hadn't spoken her name in years. She was the shadow behind every nightmare, the face I saw when I closed my eyes, not because she hurt me, but because she watched it happen. She knew, I whispered. She always knew, Doctor. Pierce didn't deny it. She just nodded, letting the truth breathe in the room like poison. Through a local support before I agreed to try. I found out where she lived. A small apartment on the outskirts of our old town. My heart pounded as I stood outside her door, my hand shaking so hard I almost couldn't knock. When she opened it, time stopped. She looked smaller, frailer, her eyes sunken and tired. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered my name, like it hurt to say it. The walls were yellowed with age. We sat at her kitchen table, and everything smelled faintly of mold and regret. We used to eat didn't you stop ago. Him? I asked. My voice didn't tremble. It cracked. She covered her mouth, and tears filled her eyes. "I tried," she said, her voice breaking. "But he said he'd kill you if I did." And I believed him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and ask why love wasn't enough to save me. But as I looked at her, I realized she was just another victim. A woman destroyed long before she could protect anyone else. That night, I didn't forgive her, but I understood. And sometimes, understanding hurts more than hate. After that meeting, something inside me shifted. For the first time, the past didn't feel like a place I had to run from. It felt like a story I had to face. I kept going to therapy, session after session, peeling back the layers of fear that had built themselves around me. Some nights I still woke up shaking, but I learned to breathe through it. I learned that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering differently. One afternoon, Dr. Pierce asked me to write a letter to the person who hurt me. "You don't have to send it," she said. "Just write it." So I did. I told him wrote everything, until my hands cramped, until the words blurred every with piece of my soul he had stolen. When I finished, I didn't burn it. I buried it under the same apple tree where I had once hidden my childhood. It felt like closing a circle, like reclaiming something I thought I'd lost forever. But I didn't know that the real revelation, the one that would tear everything apart again, was still waiting. A truth buried deeper than the pain itself, one that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about my past and about myself. It happened on a rainy afternoon, the kind that makes the world feel smaller, quieter, as if the sky itself is holding its breath. I had gone back to Dr. Pierce's office for another session, but that day she wasn't alone. Sitting beside her was a woman I had never seen before, older, neatly dressed, holding a thin folder against her chest like it contained something fragile. "This is Detective Morgan, Dr. Pierce said softly. "She's been reviewing an old case connected to your family." My stomach twisted. I didn't want to hear whatever was coming next. I wasn't ready. But Detective Morgan opened the folder anyway, her eyes never leaving mine. The tree, inside even the small shed, yellowed with age, to hide. Corners she placed bent, a single picture on the desk, one I had never seen before. It was of a man, younger, thinner, but his eyes were the same as mine. "Do you recognize him?" she asked. I shook my head, but something deep inside me already knew. The detective hesitated, then said, "That's your biological father." The man who raised me in the room wasn't him. Heavy for a long moment. Everything around me blurred. My father, but he was gone, faded, dead. The clock on the wall ticking too loudly, too slowly. I felt the ground shifting beneath, like the truth was an earthquake tearing through everything I thought I knew. "What do you mean?" I finally whispered. Detective Morgan sighed, flipping through the folder. "Your mother met your real father when she was 17. The man you grew up with. He left town. He wasn't before your father by blood. He married your mother later, after." Her voice trailed off, like she couldn't bear to finish the sentence. "After what?" I didn't need her to say it. I already knew. After she was already broken. After she was already trapped. After he had already started controlling her life. My mind flooded with images. The way he used to say I wasn't his by choice. That's why he needed the way to his hatred felt to destroy personal, what he couldn't claim. He had the always known so I wasn't his that I felt like I couldn't breathe. Dr. Pierce moved closer, her voice calm, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. "This doesn't change what happened, Eli, but it changes what it meant." I shook my head. "It changes everything." For years, I had carried his shadow inside me, his voice, his never cruelty. Was. I wasn't the idea from him. That I was somehow just made from his storm. That night, that darkness wasn't mine. The rain soaking through my clothes until I reached the edge of town. I stood on the bridge overlooking the same river I had crossed the night I escaped years ago. I stared into the water, black and cold, and whispered to the wind, "You never owned me," for the first time. Saying it didn't My feel mother like had defiance. Hidden this secret. It felt like truth. Maybe over the next few weeks. Maybe I tried to process. Maybe because she thought it didn't matter anymore. When I confronted her again, She cried in silence for almost 10 minutes before she spoke. He found out before you were born, she said, her voice trembling. He said if I ever told you, he'd make you suffer for it. I thought I was protecting. I wanted to hate her, I looked to scream that her silence had done more damage than his words I ever realized could. She had lived her entire life under the same fear that had once lived inside me. The fear of a man who believed he was God. She had carried that terror like a second skin, and even now, decades later, it hadn't left her. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was cold. You can stop being afraid. That night, I said, I went back to the apple tree anymore. One last time. But her eyes told me the truth that had held all my secrets. I dug until my fingers bled, until I reached the spot where I had buried the letter months before. When I found it, soaked and torn, I didn't cry. I just sat there, listening to the rain, reading the words I had once written in anger. You took everything from me, but now I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A line near the end that I didn't remember writing. That night, something inside me broke, but from the cracks, I found light. I stopped waiting for rescue and became my own savior. For the first time, I wasn't the helpless child they tried to silence. I was the echo of every tear they made me shed. And I was done being their victim. But I folded the letter carefully, somewhere between and pain whispered to and the survival. It ends I had here. Already begun then to I reclaim myself, leaving behind not just the grave of a secret, but the ghost of the man who had haunted every breath of my childhood. Still, even after that night, a part of me remained restless, because the truth, as freeing as it was, also opened new wounds. Who was my real father? Where had he gone? Why had he never looked for me? Those questions began to burn quietly, pulling me toward another chapter I hadn't expected, one that would lead me far from home, into the heart of another mystery I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The search began with a name, one I had never heard before, but one that now felt like a missing piece of my own face. Daniel Hartman, Detective Morgan, told me his name was. The man who had loved my mother before everything fell apart. It sounded unreal, almost cinematic, the kind of name that belonged to a stranger, not to the ghost who gave me life. She handed me a copy of an old birth certificate, faded, creased, nearly illegible. There it was, written in blue ink beside my mother's maiden name, Father. I read it over Daniel and Hartman over for days, as if the ink I carried that could explain everywhere I went, why he never came back, why I had grown up in a house full of monsters instead of love. But the truth of it was simpler and crueler. People leave, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of weakness, sometimes because running is the only way they know how to survive. I wanted to hate him, too, but deep down, if he ever wondered, I just wanted what to kind know of life he I ever thought after he was gone. I started looking for him in every way I could. Records, newspapers, online archives at the library, anything that could trace his name. The first time I saw a photograph of him, I froze. It was an old article about a construction company he had once worked for, taken nearly 20 years ago. He was smiling. It felt like looking of a half-built house of someone wearing a blue cap turned backward. If life had been kinder, they were mine. The caption said he had moved to Chicago in 2007. That became my destination. I packed a small suitcase, quit my job at the hotel, and took the cheapest bus I could find. 20 hours on the road, surrounded by strangers, and neon lights passing through the window. The hum of the engine when I became the rhythm of my heartbeat. The city felt too big for someone like me. Steel I wasn't and noise running away and endless faces. I was running. I had an address, an old one from a record dated years back. It led me to a narrow street lined with tired apartment buildings, the kind that always smell of dust and rain. Apartment 3B. I knocked 3 times. No one answered, but a neighbor, an old man with kind eyes, stepped out from across the hall. You the world looking for Danny for a second, he asked. I didn't cry. Nodded. His smile faded. I just away last year, empty, like the wind had taken everything from inside me. The man handed me a small envelope. He told me to keep this in case anyone ever came asking for him. Said maybe one day someone would. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed around the edges. My hands trembled as I opened it. I don't know the daughter name, I never met, but I've thought of you every day. My heart stopped left because the I was blurred as I read, not of you, but of what I'd become if I stayed. Your mother deserved more than my brokenness. I wanted to come back, but life had other plans. If you ever find this, know that leaving you was my biggest regret. I hope you found a way to be free. I hope you became everything I wasn't strong enough to be. I read those lines again and again, each word digging deeper into a wound I didn't know still bled. For so long, I had believed I was unwanted, unworthy, unlovable. But this letter, fragile and late as it was, proved something else. I wasn't the product of cruelty. I was born from love that had lost its way. That night, I walked along the edge of Lake Michigan. The air was cold, not the kind, the water that comes from forgetting, and in its reflection, but from forgiving. I saw something I hadn't seen before. I forgive you, both of you. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt lighter, like the ghosts that had haunted me for years had finally loosened their grip. I realized forgiveness wasn't about excusing what they had done. It was about freeing myself from the weight of it. I sat there for hours, watching the waves crash against the shore, thinking about how my life had been built on the ruins of other people's pain. And yet, somehow, I was still here, still breathing, still standing. When I returned home weeks later, everything felt different. The town, the sky, even the silence, none of it scared me anymore. I visited my mother again. This time she not cried for answers when I told her but I'd found goodbye, that he'd loved her, that he'd loved me in his own flawed way. I left her with a copy of the letter. You don't need to carry his ghost anymore, I said, or mine. As I walked away from her door, I knew it was the last time I'd look back. My story wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, the girl who had run barefoot through the rain, and the woman who finally learned
even peace
she
has
didn't
its
have to
shadows.
run at all. Because sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear his voice, the man who stole my childhood, echoing faintly, like a scar that refuses to fade. And every time I answer him in silence, you didn't win, because I'm still here, and that's enough. I went back to the house. I don't know why. Maybe because healing sometimes demands that we walk
The
through
road
the fire
that
led.
led
There was
not
the
to
same
burn,
one I had
but to
run
prove
down
we
years
can
before.
survive the
Only
heat.
now it was covered in weeds and silence. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the earth itself remembered what had happened there. The house stood crooked, half collapsed, its windows shattered, roof sagging under years of neglect. Time had done to it what I had spent years trying to do to myself. It had let it rot. The
Piece
ghosts
by
were
piece,
still here,
still
invisible
standing before
but loud.
I
felt
took a
the
deep
same chill
breath,
crawl down
my
fingers
spine.
trembling as I pushed open the door. It groaned like a wounded animal, releasing the smell of damp wood and memories I thought I'd buried forever. Dust floated through the sunlight, and for a moment it almost looked beautiful, like the house was exhaling the past. The living room was smaller than I remembered. The walls
I stepped over
broken glass were
my
now
reflection
peeling, scattered
revealing
in
the
100
wooden
tiny
skeleton
fragments
beneath.
on the floor. That felt fitting. I walked toward the hallway, the same hallway I had run through that last night. My footsteps echoed softly, like whispers, and then I reached it, his room. My chest tightened. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the knob. For years, this door had been the border between
I
who I
turned
was
the knob
and
slowly
who I had
and
to
stepped
pretend
inside.
to be. The
Now,
air was cold,
it was just
stale,
wood.
untouched. His presence lingered in the way shadows clung to corners. On the dresser, covered in dust, I found something I didn't expect. A photograph. It was of me, maybe 10 years old, standing by the tree, forced smile on my face. I stared at it for a long time, wondering why he kept. Maybe it was guilt.
I felt anger
Maybe
rise
it was
inside
pride.
me,
Maybe
thick
it
and
was
hot,
just another way
like
to
lava
possess
bubbling
what
up
he
from
couldn't
somewhere
control.
ancient.
For years, I had been afraid of this place, afraid of him. But standing there, I realized something profound. Fear doesn't live in walls. It lives in memory. And memories lose their power when you face them. I placed the photograph back on the dresser and whispered, "You don't own me anymore." My voice
The air
didn't
felt
shake.
different.
I left
Lighter,
the room,
cleaner,
closed the door
like the
gently
house
behind
itself
me,
was finally
and walked
letting
outside
me go.
into
I
the sunlight.
picked up
a small piece of broken wood from the porch and tucked it into my pocket. Not as a souvenir, but as proof that I had come back and I had survived. That night, I sat under the apple tree again, the same place where I had once buried my secret. Only this time, I wasn't hiding.
Its pages were
with
filled
me a
with
notebook,
pain,
the
rage,
same one
confusion,
I had written
and
in
hope.
all those years ago. I tore out the first page, the one that began with, "I don't know who I am." I replaced it with a new one. I wrote, "My name is Eli. I survived." Then I smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone who had forgotten. It was the smile of someone who had reclaimed every piece of themselves from the ruin. In the weeks that followed, only 3 people came.
Something new.
Then 5,
then
small
10.
support
Each
group
of
at
them
the
carried
church
their
where
own
my
version
healing of
began.
my story. Different faces, same silence. We sat in a circle, sharing the words we were once too afraid to say out loud. Some cried, some stayed quiet, but every meeting ended with the same truth: we were still here. And that was enough. I told them, pain is not your identity. It's just the soil,
Because
even
where
though
your
I had
strength grows,
faced everything,
and maybe
I
forgiveness
said it
was
as
still a
much for
journey
them.
as
Some
for
days
myself.
I felt peace, other days I felt rage, but both were part of healing. Both were proof that I was alive. Then one day, a woman approached me after the meeting, trembling, crying, clutching her hands together. She whispered, "He's still in my house. I don't know how to leave." I looked into her eyes,
And when you do,
and saw my
you won't be
16-year-old
alone.
self
That
staring
was
back.
the moment
I
I
took
understood.
her hands and said,
The purpose of
"You
pain
is not to destroy us. It's to teach us how to guide others out of the dark." And for the first time in my life, I didn't just feel free. I felt useful. The girl who had once run barefoot through the rain was now helping others find the strength to run too. But even as life began to rebuild around me, there was one last thing I needed to do. Something that would finally close the circle for good. I had to face the one place I had never dared to go. The graveyard. His grave. The man who had destroyed everything. The grave was smaller than I imagined. For years, I'd pictured it towering, cruel, something that matched the weight of what he'd done. But it wasn't. It was just a cold piece of stone, cracked at the edges, half swallowed by weeds and rain. His name was barely visible, faded by time. I stood there for a long while, the wind brushing against my hair, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. I had prepared myself for this moment, for rage, for grief, for the explosion of everything I had kept buried inside. But instead, there was silence.
It was strange,
a silence,
realizing
that
that
this
ache,
was what
just
remained of
stillness.
the man I
who
knelt
had
down,
stolen my
pressing
childhood,
my palm
a
against
handful
the
of
damp
bones
soil
beneath
the ground, powerless now, his voice forever gone. "You don't get to haunt me anymore," I whispered. The words came softly, but they felt like thunder in my chest. "You're gone, and I'm still here. I win." I thought forgiveness would come like a wave, sudden, cleansing. But it didn't. Forgiveness
came slowly.
I learned,
like the
wasn't
sun for
rising
him.
behind
It was
clouds.
for me,
For
faint
the
at
little
first,
girl who
then
had once
undeniable.
believed she'd never be free. For the teenager who ran barefoot through the rain. For the woman standing here now, strong enough to face the grave and not feel small anymore. I pulled a folded paper from my coat pocket, a letter I had written days before. It wasn't like the others. This one wasn't full of anger
You taught me
or
fear,
questions, but
it
I
was a
turned it
goodbye.
into strength. I read
You
it
gave
silently,
me silence,
the wind
but I
catching
turned
the
it
edges
into a voice.
"You broke me, but I rebuilt myself stronger than you ever imagined. You are not my story. You're just the first chapter." I placed it on the grave, weighed it down with a small stone, and stood up. My knees trembled, but my heart didn't. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of crows in the distance.
I had come
As
here
I
to
began to
close a
walk
door,
away,
and
I
for the
realized
first time
I
in
didn't
my
need
life
to look back. It stayed closed. The past was not erased. It was acknowledged, honored, and finally released. I walked through the gate and into the open air, the sunlight catching on my face. It felt different this time, warmer, fuller, like life itself was welcoming me back. On the way home, I stopped by a park, and instead of sadness, on a bench, I felt hope. Children play, because I finally
Their laughter
understood
like
something.
innocence can be stolen,
Everything mine had
but
never
it can
been also be reborn, not as naivety, but as peace. Weeks later, I returned to the church. The support group had grown, more faces, more stories, more survivors learning to speak again. That night, I shared my final story. I told them about the grave, about standing
letting
in
you
front
breathe
of what
again.
once terrified
Some
me.
of them cried,
And feeling
some
nothing
smiled,
but strength.
but when the session
forgiveness
ended,
I told
none
them
of us were the
isn't
same.
letting them win. We had all left pieces of our pain behind in that room. I looked around at the women, the men, the quiet souls who were learning to exist again. And I realized that healing was never meant to be private. It's meant to be shared. It's meant to echo. That night, as I walked shimmered
home,
under the moonlight, I passed by the apple
and for
tree
the first
last time. I didn't see a graveyard of secrets. I saw life. Growth. The same soil that once held my pain now fed something living. I placed my hand on its trunk, feeling its heartbeat beneath the bark, and whispered, "Thank you." Because somehow, this tree, this place, had carried my story when I couldn't. And now, it didn't have to anymore. Before I disappeared into the night, slowly, I the sound of the wind behind me, and said out loud the words I had waited my whole life to believe: I am free. And for the first time, I truly was. After that day at the grave, everything began to shift, not in sudden bursts of light, but in small, steady ways that I almost didn't notice at first. It was in the mornings when I woke up, and it
didn't
was in the
feel
way
that familiar
I could
weight
look
pressing
in the
on
mirror
my chest,
and recognize the woman staring back, not as the sum of her wound, but as someone who had survived them. I started working again, teaching art to children at a local community center. It was strange being surrounded by laughter after of silence, but it healed something in me that therapy couldn't. One of the girls, Sophia, always ran up to me first, her paint-covered hands waving as she shouted, "Miss Eli, look what I made." Her joy was contagious. Sometimes, when I watched her create without fear, I thought about the child I used to be, the one who wasn't allowed to dream. And I realized I was finally giving that little girl a second chance through them. I moved into a small apartment
reminded
near
me
the
of
breathing. I didn't
rhythm,
choose it for the
of
view,
life continuing,
though it was
even when
beautiful.
it's rough.
But for
the
the first
sound.
night there, I left the window open, letting the wind carry the scent of salt and freedom into the room. I lay in bed and whispered to myself, "You made it." The words didn't feel like a celebration. They felt like a truth I had waited decades to accept. Healing didn't mean erasing the past. It meant
the
learning
house,
how to
the
live
voice,
with it
the fear.
without letting
But now,
it consume
I met
me.
them differently.
Some nights
I didn't
the
fight
memories
them.
still
I
came.
told them, you can visit, but you don't live here anymore. And slowly, they stopped knocking as often. Months passed, and life began to bloom in places I thought were barren. I met someone, Daniel. He wasn't extraordinary in the cinematic way, but he was steady, kind, patient. The first time he just
reached
held
for my
it gently,
hand,
waiting,
I flinched
like
without
he
meaning
understood
to.
that
He
trust
didn't
wasn't
pull away.
something you earned with words, but with silence. He never asked for my story, but when I was ready, I told him every piece of it. He didn't say, I'm sorry. He said, you deserved better, and I'm here for the better. That sentence changed something in me. For years, I believed love was control, dependency, survival. But this
Sunday morning
this was
spent
peace.
at the farmer's
We built
market.
a life that was
Evenings
quiet
cooking
but full.
together,
Sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing until the neighbors complained. It wasn't perfect. I still had moments where shadows stretched longer than they should, but now I wasn't alone in them. Love didn't fix me. It gave me space to exist while I healed myself. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a broken story. I felt like a
apple tree
beginning.
still
One
stood,
evening,
stronger
Daniel
than ever,
and I drove
its
back to the
branches heavy with
countryside.
fruit.
I picked one, bit into it, and for the first time in my life, it tasted sweet. I smiled and said, I think she would have liked this. Daniel looked at me, confused, and I added, the girl I used to be. He nodded, didn't ask more. We stood there, the wind moving through the leaves, the sky bleeding
And I realized
orange and
that
gold. Even the darkest stories can end with light, not because the pain disappears, but because we learn how to grow around it. As we drove home that night, I looked out the window, the landscape passing in soft blurs. Somewhere between the trees and the stars, I whispered, thank you for surviving. It wasn't to anyone else. It was to me. The girl, the woman, the fighter. Because
All of
survival
them.
isn't just about escaping. It's about choosing every day to keep living with purpose, with hope, with heart. It started with a single letter. A message from a woman who had watched me speak at the local community event about trauma and recovery. Her words were shaky, but raw. I thought I was alone, but hearing you made me believe I can live again. That one sentence changed the course of my life. I didn't plan to become anyone's voice for years. I could barely find my own. But somehow, my story began to echo beyond that small room. One by one, more letters came. Survivors from across the country. People who carried stories they'd never told anyone before began to write, to share, to breathe. So I started something I never thought I could. A foundation. We called it the Second
We offered
Dawn.
workshops,
It wasn't about
therapy
charity
sessions,
It was
and
about
safe
rebirth.
spaces for those still trapped in silence. The first time I stood in front of a crowd of 200 people, my hands trembled. The lights were blinding, the room heavy with anticipation. I took a deep breath and said, I used to believe pain was my identity, but now I know it's just the proof that I survived. The applause that followed wasn't for me.
I watched faces
It
light
was
up,
for every
tears
person
mixed
in that
with
room
laughter
who had made it through holding hands in solidarity. That was the moment I realized I had turned the ugliest thing that ever happened to me into something beautiful, something powerful. Pain had been my prison, but now it was my purpose. I began traveling, speaking in schools, shelters, even prison. I met women who still whispered their stories like secrets. Every time I said I told them, I felt the weight of those words break a little more off my chest. The world began to know my name, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Articles were written, interviews recorded, and I could almost hear my younger self whisper, "See, we made it." But fame wasn't what mattered. What mattered were the moments in between. When someone came up to me after a talk, eyes wet, I wasn't a savior. I was just proof. You saved my life. That the human spirit those can be shattered, never stopped feeling, and still find a way to shine. At night, when I returned to my apartment by the ocean, I would sit by the window, listening to the waves. Sometimes I cried, not from sadness, but from gratitude, because for so long I believed my story would end in darkness. But now it was guiding others toward light. She couldn't have been older than during 16. A conference in Sao Paulo, the same age I was when I first a young girl named Laura. She walked up to me after my speech, clutching a small notebook. "I write too," she said quietly. "But my mom says no one wants to hear stories like mine." I smiled and told her the truth that had taken me decades to learn. "Then she's wrong. The world needs your story. It's the silence that keeps monsters safe." I had become the person I once needed. Trembling months later, and in that Laura embrace, sent me a letter. I felt inside was complete. A single page from her notebook. On it, she'd written, "For every night we cried alone, there is a morning waiting to hold us. Thank you for helping me find mine." I held that paper against my heart and cried, deeply, freely, without shame. Because in her words, I saw proof that pain can be rewritten. And that's when I knew even the most my story didn't end with survival. Lead to hope. It was only beginning. In every life it touched, every voice it awakened, every soul that dared to speak after hearing mine. I had spent years running from my past, but now I walked beside it, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Because the truth is, the scars never vanish. They just stop hurting when you finally understand. My hair began to gray at that lead you home. Little silver strands, and the world that shimmered in the morning light. Softer now, Daniel and I had grown old together. Our laughter etched into the walls of our small ocean apartment. Every morning, I would walk to the beach with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise bleed over the horizon. There was something sacred about that hour. The quiet before the world woke up, the sound of the waves washing over the shore. I would think about the girl I used to be, barefoot and terrified, running through the rain, believing no one would ever come for her. And every time I did, I wanted to reach through time, wrap her in my arms, and whisper, "You made it, love. You're safe now," because she deserved to know that the nightmare ended, not with revenge, but with peace. My foundation, the second dawn, there were now had grown across anything I ever imagined. Each one a safe haven for survivors like me. people who had once believed their voices didn't matter. I visited one last time before stepping down, walking through the hallways filled with laughter and warmth. On the walls were drawings, poems, photographs, living proof of resilience. A little boy handed me a paper heart with the words, "Thank you for helping my mom smile again." It wasn't about me anymore, but it was about all of us. Every soul who refused to be defined by their wounds. Pain had connected us, but healing had made us family. Before leaving, I placed my hand on the glass door and whispered, "Keep the light on. Someone else will need it." That evening, Daniel cooked dinner, pasta, our favorite. The air smelled of basil and home. We ate on the balcony. Knew what he meant. The sea stretching endlessly where it all began. "Do you ever think about going back?" The tree, he asked softly. I smiled gently and said, "I already did. And I brought myself home." He nodded, reached across the table, and took my hand. The warmth of his touch reminded me that love, when true, doesn't erase pain. It simply gives it a place to rest. After dinner, I wrote in my journal on the last same one that had carried my story through what all these years. I am what I chose to become. Then I closed it, feeling something deep inside finally settle. One morning, much later, I returned alone to the countryside. The apple tree was still there, older, like me, but standing proud. Beneath it, wildflowers had bloomed. The air smelled of earth and memory. I sat beneath its shade and closed my eyes. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. Every tear, it was every gentle, dawn, like a lullaby after the dark. Because without them, I wouldn't have become who I am. And then, for the first time, I felt something deeper than freedom. I felt gratitude. Gratitude for life itself, in all its brutal, beautiful chaos. As I stood to leave, I noticed something carved into the bark of the tree. "You can rest now, but still there, softly, the letters the girl of my who childhood name. I no traced longer them with my fingers, to be found, and she smiled. Was finally home. Years later, when my time came, they buried me by the sea. No grand speeches, no monuments, just a small stone engraved with 5 simple words. She turned pain into light. And every year, on that same stretch of beach, survivors from the second dawn gathered to tell my their stories. Was a testament to keep the fire alive. No matter some how would dark say the night, my life was marked there by tragedy, always a dawn, but I know better. Rise. Because in the end, the truth is simple. I was broken, yes, but I was never beyond repair. I found strength in the ruins, love in the silence, and meaning in the scars. And if my story lives on, it's only to remind others of one unshakable truth, that healing isn't forgetting and somewhere what hurt you. Beneath it's that learning old to dance tree, with it, a whisper until it becomes part of your rhythm, soft, not your pain, certain, and eternal. I am free.